Today we're in London. This is MegaTrends Africa. We are just shy of the United Kingdom's referendum on whether to leave or remain in the European Union, also known as Brexit. A historic moment, an important decision for the nation, but also for the rest of the world. For Brexit has economic implications such as trade with third countries and regions, including Africa. To discuss this, we welcome our panel, Edwin Laurent, Director at the Rumphel Institute and Visiting Senior Research Fellow of King's College, London. Dr. Maximiliano Mendes Parra, Research Fellow at the International Economic Development Group, Overseas Development Institute. Professor Jim Rollo, CMG Director and Co-founder of Interanalysis Limited. Honorable Yasmin Samuel Sati, Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly in South Sudan, and Catherine Ichoya, Chief Executive Officer at the Federation of National Associations of Women in Business, Eastern and Southern Africa, who is joining us on Skype from Malawi. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MegaTrends Africa. The question to all of you is, what could a post-Brexit scenario mean for Africa's agricultural trade? Edwin, with extensive experience in ACP trade matters, what's your analysis?
Well, thank you very much for having invited me to participate in this discussion, first of all, and I think it's absolutely timely. Just before coming in here today, I was reading some excerpts from the parliamentary discussions in Mauritius last week, and the leader of the opposition had asked the Prime Minister of Mauritius just about this. What would be the impact on Mauritius? And the Prime Minister went to great lengths to explain how the economy of Mauritius was very interlinked with that of the UK and the independent, and that it would have tremendous impact on Mauritius. Now, in a few days' time, UK voters will be voting as to whether Britain should stay, the United Kingdom should stay in or not. However, they will be looking at a number of, basing their decision on a number of considerations. One, of course, how Brexit will affect them individually, their jobs, the NHS, competition from migrants, etc. But as the Prime Minister was suggesting, there are wide implications. Of course, for the UK itself, Brexit will have economic implications one way or the other, social, political, etc. But for the rest of the world, that is important. Of course, Europe itself, the security of Europe, these are considerations that will be important, as well as the African countries, which have these economic partnership agreements with the European Union currently. So if the UK moves out of the EU, immediately there would be an end to those arrangements. Of course, there could be some substitute put in place, but that will be an immediate consequence, and that I certainly would be pleased to go into, along with colleagues here, what the implications of that will be for African exporters.
Would you like to comment on that in terms of that lapse, supposedly trade disruption? What exactly would be your comments on that, given that there would be this period in which a substitute arrangement in the interim is being put in place?
Yes. Yes. First, let's just go through the steps. If there were to be a vote to leave, the UK government would have to take a decision and notify. This would be in accordance with Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, and the UK would have up to 2 years to negotiate the terms of its exit. Now, the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is an arrangement that permits the ACP countries of Africa, not all of them, just those ACP countries, to export their commodities, their goods, to the European Union without having to pay duty, and there are a reduced number of other barriers. Right. That would, the United Kingdom is a part of that agreement. So if it is not within the European Union, it will no longer be part of that agreement. So therefore, exports from, say, Ghana of cocoa or other countries that belong to the EPA would now have to pay duty when they get into the United Kingdom. But of course, they would still be able to get into the rest of Europe duty free. Yes. That would be the immediate impact.
Great. Would you like to say something on that, or anybody?
No, I think that it clearly is one of the uncertainties about the Brexit. What will be the type of agreement that the UK will have with the ACP countries, particularly the African countries. It's unclear whether these agreements will have to be renegotiated again, they will be continued, etc. Whether African countries will come with different type of demands, whether the UK will have other type of demands. I mean, the UK was very critical when the EPAs were negotiated, so there might be an opportunity for having a different type of agreement with the African countries.
With your international experience in multilateral and regional trade and agricultural policies, what can you tell us?
Well, I think that in addition to the EPAs and the free trade agreements of the UK, I think there is a question, is an uncertainty associated with what would be with the so-called the most favorable nation tariff that the UK applied. This is the tariff that applies the UK or any country to the non-agreement countries. And this has important implications because for the countries that receive preferences, such as the African countries, that determines the value of the preference of what is called the preference margin. If the UK, after Brexit, continues in a sort of single market arrangement with the EU, in a customs union, well, nothing was going to change. The UK will continue applying the same tariff that is applying to the other countries and probably the same type of preferences to the African countries. But if the UK decides to not be part of the customs union, they will have to set a new, more favorable nation tariff. And that will affect the preference margins. If the UK decides to go to a very liberal type of regime with very low tariff, for example, the preference margins for the African country would be very low, and they might lose against other agriculture powers such as in Latin America or in Central America that are more competitive sometimes than African countries and will be able to access into the UK. So that is one scenario. The other scenario, if the UK decides to keep a high tariff on the agricultural products, will depend whether the UK grants preferences to the African countries of the same caliber that the EU is currently granting.
Right.
So I think that this is clearly the other uncertainty associated with trade as a result of Brexit.
Yes, and I think also it would mean if there's an MFN agreement or a clause in the EPA between the African countries and the European Union, wouldn't that mean they would have to give the same preferences to the UK?
In the specific case of the EPA, that is where the MFN clause, applies to agreements that the African countries negotiate with other parties. If the African countries grant preferences as a result of the agreement that are better to what currently they are granting to the EU members, they will have to extend that to the EU. So in the case that the UK renegotiates a new FTA with the African countries, and the African countries give better preferences in more products actually that is given to the EU, they will force by the MFN clause in the EPAs to extend that treatment to the rest of the EU. I think that this is probably a very unlikely scenario because clearly for the, that will not affect, or it's unlikely is not the point, but basically that will not affect the access of the African countries to the UK or the EU. It's more on the import side of the African countries that the MFN clause applies.
Okay, any comments on that?
I sort of agree. I think there's a lot of problems here about which direction things are going to move in. I think the first thing I would say is immediately nothing will change. Indeed, for a minimum of 2 years, the UK will still be a full member of the EU, as far as I can see. They've got up to 2 years to do the negotiations. They won't be quick. So my guess is that at this, as we stand now, on the 24th of June, nothing will change as such. We'll be facing all of the same agreements that we currently have with third countries and so on. The question is what happens next at the end of that transition period, so to speak. What is going to happen? That's quite an open question. We've no idea what the Brexiteers, the people who want Brexit's agricultural policy will be, for the first thing. We don't know whether it will be highly liberal or return of the Corn Laws, or abolition of the Corn Laws, or will it be just CAP but the British agricultural policy rather than the common agricultural policy. The label will change.
Do you want to come in?
We don't know the answer to that, but it's that's a very open question, I think. I think the second thing I would say is, I think to some degree, I think what we can expect is probably something like a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK. I don't think the so-called Norwegian option of going for the single market, which includes free movement of labour,
Shall we let
which
Edwin
is a
come
major
in?
problem in this.
Edwin, would you like to come in?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Jim has just said, but I have two difficulties. One is, I agree that there will be no change on the 24th from a legal standpoint, but from a commercial standpoint, everything changes because of the uncertainty. And I'm referring to the concerns of the ACP, the African exporters. Those exporters would have built up a business. They would not know what will happen in 2 years' time, whether they will still have access. The importers, and we can use a concrete example, Tate & Lyle, for instance. Tate & Lyle currently brings in sugar, a lot of sugar from the ACP. If there is Brexit, and one doesn't know what the UK will decide. For instance, if the UK decides to go for the completely liberal model that some are proposing, where there would be no import duties, Tate & Lyle will now be bringing in its sugar from Brazil, throwing out the ACP. So even if in 2 years' time, this does not materialize, even if there's an arrangement that is identical, a trading arrangement that is identical to what currently exists, in the meanwhile, business will not know what is happening. Now, for some small countries, that could be the tipping block. So for some of the small exporters of sugar, for instance, maybe Swaziland, etc., the uncertainty might be so damaging that the marketing could be disrupted and they could lose. I agree as well that we don't know what it will be the precise outcome, but let us focus also on what we know. that if there is a vote to move out of the EU, there will have to be some changes, and there will be a period of disruption.
Right. Okay, just building a bit on the angle on business and impact on the private sector directly, would you then say they would be less FDI, foreign direct investment, let's say, for example, in agribusiness sector in the ACP countries, African countries? Would there be some impact on that as well?
So in my view, investment is intricately linked to trade.
Right.
If they are in countries where investment is in an export industry, such as sugar, bananas, cocoa, whatever, if the market access is going to be lessened, then the investors would say, why should I invest in Ghana if I'm not sure that I will be able to sell?
Jim, you're a seasoned expert in regional economic integration and international economic research. Can you give us your thoughts on the subject? Well,
I think, let me just push on from where we just got to. I mean, the first thing to say is that total sub-Saharan African exports to the UK represent about under 4% of the sub-Saharan Africa's total exports. If you look at some of the major, and that's been falling certainly since 2012, it fell from just under 5 to now to just under 4. I think it's also important to note that for major tropical agricultural products, so cocoa, coffee, tea, perhaps some of the nuts, the tropical nuts, cashews and so on. The UK is not a very large market for sub-Saharan Africa. Like, it's under 3% for most of them, or just around 3% of total exports, sub-Saharan Africa going to them. So those are not insubstantial numbers, and of course for individual firms, the UK can be a very important market. But on average, the UK has been a declining export market for sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that's a point to hold on to in this, that trend may now continue because of the uncertainty that Edwin has pointed out. And maybe alternate markets will start to come in. Kenya, for example, doesn't export very much to China. Some work Max and I have done in recent years points that fact up. But Kenya could sell a lot of its current commodities that it sells to the UK to China, for example. So there's room for quite a lot of movement there. And I think that's it. I think the other thing we need to remember here also is it's not just the EPAs, it's also everything but arms. Right. Because that's a unilateral, that's a GSP type of arrangement. Right. And I must admit, if I were the ACP, I would be booking an appointment with the British Minister for Trade and saying to them, if you don't want to if you don't change the preferences you give us, we won't change the preferences we give you under the EPAs. And by the way, can we just sign up for EBA all over again just to make sure that I can't help but to start lobbying this early in the story.
Yasmin, you have extensive experience in carrying the voice of women in South Sudan. What would you like to say?
Thank you, Madam Josephine and the rest of the colleagues in the panel. First of all, I'm honored actually to make it through, to come and participate into this panel. It is out of my commitment. Actually, we are 3, but 2 did not make it through. As parliamentarians, actually, to talk about the Brexit is something from the side of the South Sudan is too far to us, because South Sudan has achieved it is independent just in 2011. It becomes country number 54 in Africa. And to talk much about this, also South Sudan has only one source of the export, which is oil. South Sudan is oil producer country, and that is only the source South Sudan is exporting outside. From the women perspective, and even as parliamentarians, first of all, we need to really look into that. We have legislations that can promote women in business. Without that, even it is not South Sudan alone, I think the rest of the women in business sector in Africa. So we need to talk about legislation which can provide opportunities for women in Africa to enter into the business and also get opportunities for the export. If we are not promoting women entrepreneurship, if we are not promoting the women in Africa in the business sector, we should not even talk about the Brexit, because what does they know about it? First of all, we need to encourage them to come into the business sector and do the business within their locality, because we have many challenges. Like us in South Sudan, issues of road is also a problem, because you cannot export, or you cannot even come with your local produce from the village to the town because of the roads. And the issues of logistics is also there. So for this reason, we first of all need to build the capacity of our women, the local women, in the business, encourage them to own it, and then do the trade within their locality and within their local countries. Then after that, we will also encourage them to do the trade within the region and then global. Without doing this, whether the Brexit happen or it doesn't happen, but without promoting women in business, we are doing nothing. Unless we promote women in business, we build their capacity so that they catch up. Issues of information for the women, always we are left behind as women. It's not only women of South Sudan alone, but worldwide. We are lacking number of information, not only about the business, about many other fields. So if we can avail information to them, and we can bring them in a certain level of decision making, then information reach them in time so that they cope up with the rest of the world. So that is where we can bring the women together and in trade, and we build their capacities. We encourage them, give them loans, because they have a lot of challenges, by the way, as women. Okay. Even access to land, access to funds become problem to the women. So yes. I'm here very glad with the experts, and yes. They can also make their comments and analysis. Yes.
Have any comments on that? I think it ties in a little bit to what you said in terms of the country's understanding exactly what it means, and basically trying to make a business decision, that's strategic, all things considered. But I don't know if you'd like to say something.
The only thing I would say is that underlying all of trade are firms,
right,
at the production end, and indeed at the selling end. And I think women are a very important part of that. We see across Africa that women entrepreneurs are very effective when they can get through the thicket of barriers that are specifically against them.
Yes.
So I do think that what's just been said is very important, but that's important intrinsically for development and for trade more generally. Yes. And Brexit's just one of those things that doesn't happen. But the world that's going to happen or not going to happen, we just have to make our bets on that to some degree as entrepreneurs.
Yes, that's a lot of trade facilitation opportunities right there that we're speaking of.
I just want to follow up on this, just to stress that in the area of agriculture and small farmers, and it's not just in Africa, right? Through most developing countries, women often are the majority of small farmers as
Yes.
opposed to small. So I just wanted to support this idea. And if you're looking at investment, investment is not only foreign investment, but also at that level. So I think that is quite valid. But just with respect to the specific case of Sudan, and South Sudan, one shouldn't consider that Brexit is and EPAs are not very real, because although South Sudan only exports petroleum products,
Yes.
it is in a bilateral arrangement. It is providing concessions to Europe. In fact, it is paying. Ironically, it seems it is paying for something that it is not getting anyway, because under the EPA, as we said earlier, when you export, for instance, Kenya exports to Europe, it gets its items duty-free. And it pays for that by allowing the German cars, the French cars, French cheeses, etc., to come in free of duty. You in South Sudan are doing the same thing. You are allowing these to come in free of duty, but you are not getting any real benefit.
Yes.
So it's important to realize that. The other point I want to make is on the importance of the UK market. And just a few weeks ago, I'd done some work, though it was on the Caribbean, and it's in some ways fairly similar.
Right.
What we found overall is that the total exports to the UK were only a small percentage of the total to the European Union.
Right.
But, and that is the very
big
important, but when one breaks this down, one sees that tends often to be certain commodities, particularly petroleum, the mineral products, that are the bulk.
Right.
However, some of the more labor-intensive products than the agricultural products, there tends to be a much greater share going to the UK. And for some countries, small countries, we found that they had no market in continental Europe. The only market was the UK.
The UK.
Yeah.
Yes. Catherine, with international experience in women's economic empowerment, what's your analysis?
Britain has had very good and mutually constructive trading relations with the members. And we were shocked as women to hear that actually UK would be exiting from EU. Why? Because this would mean that the relationship that we have enjoyed in terms of the gains and the safeguards is really going to come to an end. This has been over here, and I want to give you examples. A lot of women in particular, and I would say between 60 to 80% of the labor for production, both for household consumption and for export market, is really in the hands of women. This would have a negative impact. As a matter of fact, have a multiplier effect on almost all the sectors of the economy. Which sectors am I talking about? If you look at the commodities, the tea, the coffee, horticultural products, women are in charge. This has created jobs for women who are picking tea, they pick coffee, and over years, most of the countries, including Kenya, for instance, in Malawi, you are saying that a lot of women will be jobless. You are saying that the revenue that they generate or they take back home will not be there. We are saying also that the new standard that will come with this other package would definitely have an impact on both health and the technical issues. Look at the rules of origin, trade facilitation, and existing credit facilities. Most of the companies that are promoting floriculture have invested heavily. They have employed a lot of women. What this means is that it is going to have a direct impact on our financial sector. The investments that have been put in place, both human and capital, at the same time, within the financial sector, for example, in Kenya, you will notice that we have a mushrooming of various financial institutions. What does that mean? When it is, you are saying that most of our women who have opened accounts in those financial institutions will no longer be able to go to actually to benefit from the resources that they have been able to put in place. In addition to that, it is very, very sad to imagine that when we are talking about the African Union Agenda 2063, when we are talking about sustainable development goals, where we are saying we need to have a global strategy to optimize use of Africa's resources for the benefit of all Africans. Majority of the resources we have, especially in the agricultural sector, are women. So, in essence, we are saying we are going to be addressing more issues around poverty, problems, less revenue. This is definitely going to have an impact on the socio-economic environment. Coming from FEMCOM, I can tell you that EU has put in a lot of money to support commercial programs, cluster programs. We have had cassava and textile cluster programs, even handcraft, like what I am wearing, and also my, which will trigger down again to the issue around the extractive industry and mining sector, where we are promoting our women who have already come from the agricultural sector. They have now gone even to other sectors in the service and hospitality industry. So, in a nutshell, it is going to be a disaster. My own feeling is that we need to nurture the relationship that we have enjoyed with the British, because we saw UK as an entry point to the larger market within the EU, because we enjoy same administrative structure. We have had training programs based on their packages of training that have helped us to upscale the capacity of our women, and now we are talking about the youth. So where does that lead us?
Okay, thank you. Can we have others come in on that point?
I think that she makes a very good point associated with the relationship with the UK, and I would like to bring another issue related to this, that is moving beyond the issue of tariff.
Right.
That is the issue of standards and TBTs. That in the event of Brexit, and again, with a lot of uncertainty of what will be the relationship between the UK and the EU, that might change. Nowadays, I mean, you export to the EU and you meet a single standard, and that is good to in Germany or in the UK. If the UK is no longer part of the EU and doesn't have any kind of arrangement in terms of a single market, in the future might mean that there will be also a standard for the UK different from the one of the EU. And for African exporters, and this is very relevant in the case of agricultural products, SPS and also TBTs, that may mean that they will need to meet two standards if they want to continue exporting to Germany and to the UK, and that means more cost, I mean, for firms in Africa. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, just to build on what you're saying, very complicated also, because right now, as you point out, it's very difficult to understand and actually meet the standards, the SPS, as they are right now. So if there's a dual set of standards and SPS, that could mean a lot of problems for African traders. Okay, I have one last question for all of you. Do you think Britain should leave or remain in the European Union? Edward?
Since you've asked me first, Josephine, if you don't mind, I would prefer not to answer the question in the way that you have put it.
Okay.
I do have a personal opinion, because fortunately I happen to be a voter here and will be voting. However, in the context of this discussion, I would rather look at this as what is good for African signatories of the Economic Partnership Agreement? What would be better for them? On the plus side, one possibility would essentially be that the successor arrangement, the one that is eventually negotiated, gives them something that is better than what they have now. I've been thinking about that, and I can imagine just one situation where this would work, and this might be in the case of a commodity like bananas, where several African countries export bananas to the UK, but they are in competition with some other suppliers like the Dominican Republic, which is very low cost, etc. Prior to the UK joining the single market in '92, there were it maintained restrictions on Latin American bananas, etc. So if it were to go back to that old arrangement, then it would be better, of course, for ACP suppliers. Actually, I think this is highly unlikely. So therefore, since I'm not able to think of any other situation where ACP trade would be better, I cannot therefore propose that it would be a good thing for ACP. I see risk for the ACP at best and possible losses. Now earlier on, Jim, I think, was referring to some other areas of difficulty. One in terms of the finances and the funding that is provided. This would, of course, no longer the UK would no longer be making a contribution to the EDF because it is part. It no longer is part. Absolutely. So the EDF will drop. Now I think there's a more, in my view, a more important political fallout, which, and I'm not saying this because I'm in the UK or because I like the British. The UK has a particularly positive international development outlook. And I think this is probably part of its history, its long association with Africa, with India, with other countries. Losing that in Europe, I think will make the EU that much less of a caring group. What happened before, and if I just go back a little into history, in the old days, Europe was very much a Western European. It was Atlanticist in its outlook. As it expanded towards the center, so did its focus move away from the Atlantic borders and that international. I think that a Europe without the EU would be much more inward-looking and less pro-development. So for that, I would think from an African standpoint, the advice to voters in the UK would be to vote to stay. Okay.
Max, leave or remain?
Well, I will also elegantly dodge the question, basically. But no, because, well, I am not a voter, and I think I definitely have my position. But I think that this is an opportunity from the African perspective of reflect a bit of how vulnerable is African position, not only African, but other developing countries in terms of trade. I mean, that this thing that in terms of global economics, I think there is a general consensus that the effect of Brexit tends to be minimum, but we are reflecting about the effect in terms of Africa. That means that it might have an effect and probably will have an effect. So I think there is a good opportunity to reflect, and as Jim pointed, I think that clearly it's a good opportunity. Now reflection, now start thinking in terms of an opportunity to take a probably a more aggressive type of approach in terms of the trade, looking for markets outside the traditional type of markets and outside the commodities typical that have been in the last 10 years in terms associated with minerals, etc., to China. So Jim made a point of Kenya not exporting to China. So I think it's a good opportunity to start thinking, why is that the case? Why is that Kenya is exporting beans and is exporting flowers to the EU and is exporting them to China? So I think that probably I think that probably I will take it from the development perspective as an opportunity to think and to devise a new strategy, a new insertion strategy for Africa in the world economy.
Going back to the drawing board. Okay, Jim, what's your vote?
Well, I've already voted.
Can you tell us what that is?
Because I had a postal vote and I voted to remain.
Okay. Tell us why.
Well, I mean, most of my reasoning, I have to say, was about the impact on the British economy, which I think will be a significant adjustment cost. You know, in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, we won't notice, maybe. Maybe, as Mr. Gove, the leader of the Leave campaign, would say, there'll be a few bumps on the road. Those bumps are going to be quite nasty.
Right.
And I think it will be bad. But coming back to the question of Africa, I think Catherine made an extremely important point that DFID and the institutions around DFID, the Department for International Development here in London, have been a major, how shall I say, policy entrepreneur in the European context. And has spent I worked for them a long time ago, and I was on the European Development Fund Committee at that time, and we definitely were the only ones putting ideas in, and not a lot has changed since then. So I think there is an issue there that Catherine may want to pick up on. Whatever happens, there's going to be messiness around the whole question of the existing arrangements with the UK through the EU. How that's going to work, as we've, I think, explored, is going to be quite difficult, and there will be adjustment costs for overseas partners as well as for domestic operators in this. So I think that will be a bad thing. I think the other thing is that British politics may change quite a lot as a result of this, and I think the British commitment to meeting the 0.7% of GNI target for aid spending may well come under severe examination if UKIP get into power on the back of this, if the right wing of the Conservative Party is the, how shall I say, the dominant wing. We might find that too. So I think the aid situation, I don't think can be taken for granted under Brexit. Can I just say one other small thing? Even if we vote Remain, it's going to be narrow. I mean, 50-50 it stands at the moment. That means the subject will not go away.
Right.
And that means that all the people who voted to leave will have quite a lot of influence on any government.
Right.
So whatever happens, it's going to be a change from that perspective.
Yasmin, leave or remain?
Yeah, I think we have a similar situation like when we were in One Sudan. And in 2011, actually, we decided to go for a referendum. And South Sudan decided to move away from Sudan. And they voted. The result is that now we are separate to Sudan. The other one is Sudan, and we call ourselves South Sudan. So I want to say that the decision lies in the hands of the citizen, of the British, because I'm not a voter like Edwin has said, but we are beneficiaries from EU. As I spoke now, we have one of the project of outreach to the members of the parliament is being sponsored by EU through Belgium organization. So also as women, I have touched something about the role of the women to be empowered through entrepreneurship. I think we are also looking forward to become a good business women in the sector of the trade. And we also wanted to enter into a serious threat with the global regions. So in this perspective, that I will say that it is not like in the parliament. You know, in the parliament, you can determine the number for voting through or voting out, but referendum is quite different. Now the British Parliament or the EU Parliament cannot decide this phase in the Parliament. It is now through the citizen, and the referendum will determine the results. So I can say that in my own view, actually challenges of living is a lot from challenges of leaving the EU is bigger than remaining inside. But all in all, the decision lies in the hands of the citizen of the British. But we are coming in.
Oh, thank you. Catherine, leave or remain?
Remain, absolutely. We remain. I would even propose that we need to talk more to safeguard terrorism at the same time. I think the voice of FEMCOM, bringing the constituency of women from overpopulation of 450 in COMESA is critical. I believe that now we are dealing with the issues of global citizenry, and we need to build on the gains and the relationship that we have established with our sisters in Britain. I salute the trading partners in Britain, and I would say that we need to engage deeper, because it looks like we will go back to the structural adjustment issue of looking into how we are going to cushion the issues related to women if we say that we are going to exit. My belief and prayer is that we are remaining.
We have come to the end of the show. Big thank you to our panelists, Edwin, Max, Jim, Yasmin, and Catherine. Keep watching our show. Until next time, I am Josephine Hose for MegaTrends Africa.